Sapiens, and they lived happily ever after. The last 500 years have witnessed a breathtaking series of revolutions. The Earth has been united into a single ecological and historical sphere. The economy has grown exponentially, and humankind today enjoys the kind of wealth that used to be the stuff of fairy tales. Science and the Industrial Revolution have given humankind superhuman powers and practically limitless energy. The social order has been completely transformed, as have politics, daily life, and human psychology. But are we happier? Did the wealth humankind accumulated over the last 5 centuries translate into a newfound contentment? Did the discoveries of inexhaustible energy resources open before us an inexhaustible store of bliss? Going further back, have the 70 or so turbulent millennia since the cognitive revolution made the world a better place to live? Was the late Neil Armstrong, whose footprint remains intact on the windless moon, happier than the nameless hunter-gatherer who 30,000 years ago left her handprint on the wall of the Chauvet Cave? If not, what was the point of developing agriculture, cities, writing, coinage, empires, science, and industry? Historians seldom ask such questions. They do not ask whether the citizens of Uruk and Babylon were happier than their foraging ancestors, whether the rise of Islam made Egyptians more pleased with their lives, or how the collapse of the European empires in Africa have influenced the happiness of countless millions. Yet these are the most important questions one can ask in history. Most current ideologies and political programs are based on rather flimsy ideas concerning the real source of human happiness. Nationalists believe that the political self-determination is essential for our happiness. Communists postulate that everyone would be blissful under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Capitalists maintain that only the free market can ensure the greatest happiness of the greatest number by creating economic growth and material abundance, and by teaching people to be self-reliant and enterprising. What would happen if serious research were to disprove these hypotheses? If economic growth and self-reliance do not make people happier, what's the benefit of capitalism? What if it turns out that the subjects of large empires are generally happier than the citizens of independent states, and that, for example, Ghanaians are happier under British control, under British colonial rule, than under their own homegrown dictators? What would that say about the process of decolonization and the value of national self-determination? These are all hypothetical possibilities, because so far historians have avoided raising these questions, not to mention answering them. They have researched the history of just about everything: politics, society, economics, gender, diseases, sexuality, food, clothing, and yet they seldom stop to ask how these influence human happiness. Though few have studied the long-term history of happiness, almost every scholar and layperson has some vague preconception about it. In one common view, human capabilities have increased throughout history. Since humans generally use their capabilities to alleviate miseries and fulfill aspirations, it follows that we must be happier than our medieval ancestors, and they must have been happier than their Stone Age hunter-gatherers. But this progressive account is unconvincing. As we've seen, new aptitudes, behaviors, and skills do not necessarily make for a better life. When humans learned to farm in the agricultural revolution, their collective power to shape the environment increased, but a lot of the many individual humans grew harsher. Peasants had to work harder than foragers to eke out a less varied and nutritious food. They were far more exposed to disease and exploitation. Similarly, the spread of European empires greatly increased the collective power of humankind by circulating ideas, technologies, and crops, and opening new avenues of commerce. Yet this was hardly good news for millions of Africans, Native Americans, and Aboriginal Australians. Given the proven human propensity for misusing power, it seems naive to believe that the more clout people have, the happier they will be. Some challengers of this view take a diametrically opposed position. They argue for a reverse correlation between human capabilities and happiness. Power corrupts, they say, and as humankind gained more and more power, it created a cold, mechanistic world, ill-suited to our real needs. Evolution molded our minds and bodies to the life of hunter-gatherers. The transition first to agriculture and then to industry has condemned us to living unnatural lives that cannot give full expression to our inherent inclinations and instincts, and therefore cannot satisfy our deepest yearnings. Nothing in the comfortable lives of the urban middle class can approach the wild excitement and sheer joy experienced by a forager band on a successful mammoth hunt. Every new invention just puts another mile between us and the Garden of Eden. And yet this romantic insistence on seeing a dark shadow behind each invention is as dogmatic as the belief of the inevitability of progress. Perhaps we are out of touch with our inner hunter-gatherer, but it's not all bad. For instance, over the last 2 centuries, modern medicine has decreased child mortality from 33% to less than 5%. Can anyone doubt that this made a huge contribution to the happiness, not only for the children who would have otherwise died, but also of their families and friends? A more nuanced position takes the middle road. Until the scientific revolution, there was no clear correlation between power and happiness. Medieval peasants may indeed have been more miserable than their hunter-gatherer forebears, but in the past few centuries, humans have learned to use the capacities more wisely. The triumphs of modern medicine are just one example. Other unprecedented achievements include the steep drop in violence, the virtual disappearance of international wars, the near elimination of large-scale famines. Yet this, too, is an oversimplification. Firstly, it bases its optimistic assessment on a very small sample of years. The majority of humans began to enjoy the fruits of modern medicine no earlier than 1850, and the drastic drop in the child mortality is the 20th century phenomenon. Mass families continued to blight much of humanity. Mass famines continued to blight much of humanity up to the middle of the 20th century. During Communist China's Great Leap Forward of 1958 to 1961, somewhere between 10 and 50 million human beings starved to death. International wars became rare only after 1945, largely thanks to the new threat of nuclear annihilation. Hence, though the last few decades have been an unprecedented golden age for humanity, it is too early to know whether this represents a fundamental shift in the currents of history, or an ephemeral eddy of good fortune. When judging modernity, it is all too tempting to take the viewpoint of a 21st century middle-class Westerner. We must not forget the viewpoints of a 19th century Welsh coal miner, Chinese opium addict, or Tasmanian Aborigine. Truganagi is no less important than Homer Simpson. Secondly, even the brief golden age of the last half century may turn out to have sown the seeds of future catastrophe. Over the last few decades, we have been disturbing the ecological equilibrium of our planet in a myriad of new ways, with what seemed likely to be dire consequences. A lot of evidence indicates that we are destroying the foundations of human prosperity in an orgy of reckless consumption. Finally, we can congratulate ourselves on the unprecedented accomplishments of modern sapiens only if we ignore the fate of all other animals. Much of the vaunted material wealth that shields us from disease and famine was accumulated at the expense of laboratory monkeys, dairy cows, and conveyor belt chickens. Over the last 2 centuries, tens of billions of them have been subjected to the regime of industrial exploitation, whose cruelty has no precedent in the annals of planet Earth. If we accept a mere tenth of what animal rights activists are claiming, then modern industrial agriculture might well be the greatest crime in history. When evaluating global happiness, it is wrong to count the happiness of only the upper class, of Europeans, or of men. Perhaps it is also wrong to consider only the happiness of humans. Sapiens, counting happiness. So far, we have discussed happiness as if it were largely a product of material factors, such as health, diet, and wealth. If people are richer and healthier, then they must also be happier. But is that really so obvious? Philosophers, priests, and poets have brooded over the nature of happiness for millennia, and many have concluded that social, ethical, and spiritual factors have as great an impact on our happiness as material conditions. Perhaps people in modern affluent societies suffer greatly from alienation and meaninglessness despite their prosperity, and perhaps our less well-to-do ancestors found much more contentment in community, religion, and a bond with nature. In recent decades, psychologists and biologists have taken up the challenge of studying scientifically what really makes people happy. Is it money, family, genetics, or perhaps virtue? The first step is to define what is being measured. The generally accepted definition of happiness is subjective well-being. Happiness, according to this view, is something I feel inside myself, a sense of either immediate pleasure or long-term contentment with the way my life is going. If it's something felt inside, how can it be measured from the outside? Presumably, we can do so by asking people to tell us how they feel. So psychologists or biologists who want to assess how happy people feel give them questionnaires to fill out and tally the results. A typical subjective well-being questionnaire asks interviewees to grade on a scale of 0 to 10 in their agreement with statements such as, "I feel pleased with the way I am," "I feel that life is very rewarding," "I am optimistic about the future," and "life is good." The researcher then adds up all the answers and calculates the interviewee's general level of subjective well-being. Such questionnaires are used in order to correlate happiness with various subjective factors. One study might compare 1,000 people who earn $100,000 a year with 1,000 people who earn $50,000. If the study discovers that the first group has an average subjective well-being level of 8.7, while the latter has an average of only 7.3, the researcher may reasonably conclude that there is a positive correlation between wealth and subjective well-being. To put it in simple English, money brings happiness. The same method can be used to examine whether people living in democracies are happier than people living in dictatorships, and whether married people are happier than singles, divorcees, or widowers. This provides a grounding for historians who can examine wealth, political freedom, and divorce rates in the past. If people are happier in democracies, and married people are happier than divorcees, a historian has a basis for arguing that the democratization process of the last few decades contributed to the happiness of humankind, whereas the growing rates of divorce indicate an opposite trend. This way of thinking is not flawless, but before pointing out some of the holes, it's worth considering the findings. One interesting conclusion is that money does indeed bring happiness, but only up to a point, and beyond that point has little significance. For people stuck at the bottom of the economic ladder, more money means greater happiness. If you're an American single mother earning $12,000 a year, cleaning houses, and you suddenly win $500,000 in the lottery, you will probably experience a significant and long-term surge in your subjective well-being. You'll be able to feed and clothe your children without sinking further into debt. However, if you're a top executive earning $250,000 a year and you win $1 million on the lottery, or your company board suddenly decides to double your salary, your surge is likely to last only a few weeks. According to the empirical findings, it's almost certainly not going to make a big difference in the way you feel over the long run. You'll buy a snazzier car, move into a palatial home, or get used to drinking Chateau Petrus instead of California Cabernet. But it'll soon all seem routine and unexceptional. Another interesting finding is that illness decreases happiness in the short term, but is a source of long-term distress only if a person's condition is constantly deteriorating, or if the disease involves ongoing and debilitating pain. People who are diagnosed with chronic illnesses, such as diabetes, are usually depressed for a while, but if the illness does not get worse, then they adjust their newfound condition, and their rate of happiness as highly as then they adjust to their condition and their rate of happiness as highly as healthy people do. Imagine that Lucy and Luke are middle-class twins who agree to take part in a subjective well-being study. On the way back from the psychology laboratory, Lucy's car is hit by a bus, leaving Lucy with a number of broken bones and a permanently lame leg. Just as the rescue crew is cutting her out of the wreckage, the phone rings and Luke shouts that he has won the lottery's $10 million jackpot. 2 years later, she'll be limping and he'll be a lot richer. But when the psychologist comes around for the follow-up study, they are both likely to give the same answers they did on the morning of that fateful day. Family and community seem to have more impact on our happiness than money and health. People with strong families who live in a tight-knit and supportive community are significantly happier than people whose families are dysfunctional and who have never found or never sought a community to be part of. Marriage is particularly important. Repeated studies have found that there is a very close correlation between good marriages and high subjective well-being, and between bad marriages and misery. This holds true irrespective of economic and even physical conditions. An impecunious invalid surrounded by a loving spouse, a devoted family, and a warm community may well feel better than an alienated billionaire, provided that the invalid's poverty is not too severe and that his illness is not degenerative or painful. This raises the possibility that the immense improvement of material conditions over the last 2 centuries was offset by the collapse of the family and the community. If so, the average person might well be no happier today than in 1800. Even the freedom we value so highly may be working against us. We can choose our spouses, friends, and neighbors, but they can choose to leave us. With the individual wielding unprecedented power to decide her own path in life, we find it ever harder to make commitments. We thus live an increasingly lonely world of unraveling communities and families. But the most important findings of all this is that happiness does not really depend on objective conditions of either wealth, health, or even community. Rather, it depends on the correlation between objective conditions and subjective expectations. If you want a bullock cart and get a bullock cart, you are content. If you want a brand new Ferrari and only get a second-hand Fiat, you feel deprived. This is why winning the lottery has, over time, the same impact over people's happiness as a debilitating car accident. When things improve, expectations balloon, and consequently, even dramatic improvements in objective conditions leave us dissatisfied. When things deteriorate, expectations shrink, and consequently, even a severe illness might leave you pretty much as happy as you were before. You might say that you didn't need a bunch of psychologists and their questionnaires to discover this. Prophets, poets, and philosophers realized thousands of years ago that being satisfied with what you have is far more important than getting more of what you want. Still, it's nice when modern research, bolstered by lots of numbers and charts, reaches the same conclusions that the ancients did. The crucial importance of human expectations has far-reaching implications for understanding the history of happiness. If happiness depended only on objective conditions such as wealth, health, and social relations, it would have been relatively easy to investigate its history. The finding that it depends on subjective expectations makes the task of historians far harder. We moderns have an arsenal of tranquilizers and painkillers at our disposal, but our expectations of ease and pleasure, and our intolerance of inconvenience and discomfort have increased to such an extent that we may well suffer from pain more than our ancestors ever did. It's hard to accept this line of thinking. The problem is a fallacy of reasoning embedded deep in our psyches. When we try to guess or imagine how happy other people are now, or how people in the past were, we inevitably imagine ourselves in their shoes. But that won't work, because it pastes our expectations on the material conditions of others. In modern affluent societies, it is customary to take a shower and change your clothes every day. Medieval peasants went without washing for months on end, and hardly ever changed their clothes. The very thought of living like that, filthy and reeking to the bone, is abhorrent to us. Yet medieval peasants seem not to have minded. They were used to the feel and smell of a long unlaundered shirt. And it's not that they wanted a change of clothes, but it's not that they wanted a change of clothes, but that they couldn't get it. They had what they wanted. So, at least as far as clothing goes, they were content. That's not so surprising when you think of it. After all, our chimpanzee cousins seldom wash and never change their clothes. Nor are we disgusted by the fact that our pet dogs and cats don't shower or change their coats daily. We pat, hug and kiss them all the same. Small children in affluent societies often dislike showering, and it takes them years of education and parental discipline to adopt this supposedly attractive custom. It is all manner of expectations. If happiness is determined by expectations, then two pillars of our society, mass media and the advertising industry, may unwittingly be depleting the globe's reservoirs of contentment. If you were an 18-year-old youth in a small village 5,000 years ago, you'd probably think you were good looking because you were only 50 other men in your village, and most of them were either old, scarred, or wrinkled, or still little kids. But if you were a teenager today, you're a lot more likely to feel inadequate. Even if the other guys in school are an ugly lot, you don't measure yourself against them, but against the movie stars, athletes, and supermodels that you see all day on television, Facebook, and giant billboards. So maybe third world discontent is fomented not merely by poverty, disease, corruption, and political oppression, but also by mere exposure to first world standards. The average Egyptian was far more likely to die of starvation, plague, or violence under the Hosni Mubarak than under Ramesses II or Cleopatra. The average Egyptian was far less likely to die from starvation, plague, or violence under Hosni Mubarak than under Ramesses II or Cleopatra. Never had the material condition of most Egyptians been so good. You'd think that they would have been dancing in the streets in 2011, thanking Allah for their good fortune. Instead, they rose up furiously to overthrow Mubarak. They weren't comparing themselves to their ancestors under the pharaohs, but rather to their contemporaries in Obama's America. If that's the case, even immortality might lead to discontent. Suppose science comes up with a cure for all diseases, effective anti-aging therapies, and regenerative treatments that keep people indefinitely young. In all likelihood, the immediate result would be an unprecedented epidemic of anger and anxiety. Those unable to afford the new miracle treatments, the vast majority of people, will be beside themselves with rage. Throughout history, the poor and the oppressed comforted themselves with the thought that at least death is even-handed, that the rich and powerful will also die. The poor will not be comfortable with the thought that they have to die, while the rich remain young and beautiful forever. But the tiny minority able to afford the new treatments will not be euphoric either. They will have much to be anxious about. Although the new therapies could extend life and youth, they cannot revive corpses. How dreadful to think that I and my loved ones can live forever, but only if we don't get hit by a truck or blown to smithereens by a terrorist. Potentially amortal people are likely to grow averse to seeking even the slightest risk, and the agony of losing a spouse, child, or close friend will be unbearable. Sapiens, Chemical Happiness. Social scientists distribute subjective well-being questionnaires and correlate the results with socioeconomic factors such as wealth and political freedom. Biologists use the same questionnaires but correlate the answers people give them with biochemical and genetic factors. Their findings are shocking. Biologists hold that our mental and emotional world is governed by biochemical mechanisms shaped by millions of years of evolution. Like all other mental states, our subjective well-being is not determined by external parameters such as salary, social relations, or political rights. Rather, it is determined by a complex system of nerves, neurons, and synapses in various biochemical substances such as serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. Nobody is ever made happy by winning the lottery, buying a house, getting a promotion, or even finding true love. People are made happy by one thing and one thing only: pleasant sensations in their body. A person who just won the lottery or found new love and jumps for joy is not really reacting to the money or the lover. She is reacting to various hormones coursing through her bloodstream and to the storm of electrical signals flashing between different parts of her brain. Unfortunately, for all hopes of creating heaven on earth, our internal biochemical system seems to be programmed to keep happiness levels relatively constant. There's no natural selection for happiness as such. A happy hermit's genetic line will go extinct as the genes of a pair of anxious parents get carried into the next generation. Happiness and misery play a role in evolution only to the extent that they encourage or discourage survival and reproduction. Perhaps it's not too surprising, then, that evolution has molded us to be neither too miserable nor too happy. It enables us to enjoy a momentary rush of pleasant sensations, but never let these feelings last forever. Sooner or later they subside and give place to unpleasant sensations. For example, evolution provided pleasant feelings as rewards to males who spread their genes by having sex with fertile females. If sex were not accomplished by such pleasure, few males would bother. At the same time, evolution made sure that these pleasant feelings quickly subsided. If orgasms were to last forever, the very happy males would die of hunger for lack of interest in food, and would not take the trouble to look for additional fertile females. Some scholars compare human biochemistry to an air conditioning system that keeps the temperature constant. Come heat wave or snowstorm, events might momentarily change the temperature, but the air conditioning system always returns the temperature to the same set point. Some air conditioning systems are set at 25 degrees Celsius, others are set at 20 degrees. Human happiness conditioning systems also differ from person to person. On a scale from 1 to 10, some people are born with a cheerful biochemical system that allows their mood to swing between levels 6 and 10, stabilizing with time at 8. Such a person is quite happy, even if she lives in an alienating big city, loses all her money in a stock exchange crash, and is diagnosed with diabetes. Other people are cursed with a gloomy biochemistry that swings between 3 and 7 and stabilizes at 5. Such an unhappy person remains depressed even if they enjoy the support of a tight-knit community, win millions in the lottery, and are as healthy as an Olympic athlete. Indeed, even if our gloomy friend wins $50 million in the morning, discovers the cure for both AIDS and cancer by noon, makes peace between the Israelis and Palestinians that afternoon, and then in the evening reunites with her long-lost child who disappeared years ago, she would still be incapable of experiencing anything beyond level 7 happiness. Her brain is simply not built for exhilaration, come what may. Think for a moment of your family and friends. You know some people who remain relatively joyful no matter what befalls them, and then there are those who are always disgruntled, no matter what gifts the world lays at their feet. We tend to believe that if we could just change our workplace, get married, finish writing that novel, buy a new car, or repay the mortgage, we would be on top of the world. Yet when we get what we desire, we don't seem to be any happier. Buying cars and writing novels does not change our biochemistry. They can startle it for a fleeting moment, but it is soon back to its set point. How can this be squared with the above-mentioned psychological and sociological findings that, for example, married people are happier on average than singles? First, these findings are correlations. The direction of causation may be the opposite of what some researchers have assumed. It is true that married people are happier than singles or divorcees, but that does not necessarily mean that marriage produces happiness. It could be that happiness causes marriage, or more correctly, that serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin bring about and maintain a marriage. People who are born with a cheerful biochemistry are generally happy and content. Such people are more attractive spouses, and consequently they have a greater chance of getting married. They are also less likely to divorce, because it is far easier to live with a happy and content spouse than with a depressed and dissatisfied one. Consequently, it is true that married people are happier on average than singles, but a single woman prone to gloom because of her biochemistry would not necessarily become happier if she were to hook up with a husband. In addition, most biologists are not fanatics. They maintain that happiness is determined mainly by biochemistry, but they agree that psychological and sociological factors also have their place. Our mental air conditioning system has some freedom of movement within the predetermined borders. It is almost impossible to exceed the upper and lower emotional boundaries, but marriage and divorce can have an impact on the area between these two. Somebody born with an average level of 5 happiness would never dance wildly in the streets, but a good marriage should enable her to enjoy level 7 from time to time, and to avoid the despondency of level 3. If we accept the biological approach to happiness, then history turns out to be of minor importance, since most historical events have had no impact on our biochemistry. History can change the external stimuli that cause serotonin to be secreted, yet it does not change the resulting serotonin levels, and hence it cannot make people happier. Compare the medieval French peasant to a modern Parisian baker. The peasant lived in an unheated hut overlooking the local pigsty, while the banker goes home to a splendid penthouse with all the latest technology gadgets and a view of the Champs-Élysées. Intuitively, we would expect the banker to be much happier than the peasant. However, mud huts, penthouses, and the Champs-Élysées don't really determine our mood. Serotonin does. When the medieval peasant completed the construction of his mud hut, his brain neurons secreted serotonin, bringing it up to level X. When in 2014 the banker made the last payment on his wonderful penthouse, brain neurons secreted similar amounts of serotonin, bringing it up to a similar level X. It makes no difference to the brain that the penthouse is far more comfortable than the mud hut. The only thing that matters is that the present level of serotonin is X. Consequently, the banker would not be one iota happier than his great-great-great-grandfather, the poor medieval peasant. This is true not only of private lives, but also great collective events. Take, for example, the French Revolution. The revolutionaries were busy. They executed the king, gave lands to the peasants, declared the rights of man, abolished noble privileges, and waged war against the whole of Europe. Yet none of that changed French biochemistry. Consequently, despite all the political, social, ideological, and economic upheavals brought about by the revolution, its impact on French happiness was small. Those who won a cheerful biochemistry in the genetic lottery were just as happy before the revolution as after. Those with a gloomy biochemistry complained about Robespierre and Napoleon with the same bitterness as with which they complained about Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. If so, what good was the French Revolution? If people did not become any happier, then what was the point of all that chaos, fear, blood, and war? Biologists would never have stormed the Bastille. People think that this political revolution or the social reform will make them happy, but their biochemistry tricks them time and time again. There is only one historical development that has had real significance. Today, when we finally realize that the keys to happiness are in the hands of our biochemical system, we can stop wasting our time on politics and social reforms, putschs and ideologies, and focus instead on the only thing that will make us truly happy, manipulating our biochemistry. If we invest billions in understanding our brain chemistry and developing appropriate treatments, we can make people far happier than ever before, without the need of revolutions. Prozac, for example, does not change regimes, but by raising serotonin levels, it lifts people out of their depression. Nothing captures the biological argument better than the famous New Age slogan, "Happiness begins within." Money, social status, plastic surgery, beautiful houses, powerful positions, none of these will bring you happiness. Lasting happiness comes only from serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. In Aldous Huxley's dystopian novel, Brave New World, published in 1932 at the height of the Great Depression, happiness is the supreme value, and psychiatric drugs replaces the polis and the ballot as the foundation of politics. Every day, each person takes a dose of soma, a synthetic drug which makes people happy without harming their productivity and efficiency. The world state that governs the entire globe is never threatened by wars, revolutions, strikes, or demonstrations, because all people are supremely content with their current conditions, whatever they may be. Huxley's vision of the future is far more troubling than George Orwell's 1984. Huxley's world seems monstrous to most readers, but it is hard to explain why. Everybody is happy all the time, and what could be wrong with that? Sapiens, the meaning of life. Huxley's disconcerting world is based on the biological assumption that happiness equals pleasure. To be happy is no more and no less than experiencing pleasant bodily sensations. Since our biochemistry limits the volume and duration of these sensations, the only way to make people experience a high level of happiness over an extended period of time is to manipulate their biochemical system. But that definition of happiness is contested by some scholars. In the famous study, Daniel Kahneman, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, asked people to recount a typical work day, going through it episode by episode and evaluating how much they enjoyed it or disliked each moment. He discovered that what seems to be a paradox in most people's views of their lives. Take the work involved in raising a child. Kahneman found that when counting moments of joy and moments of drudgery, bringing up a child turns out to be a rather unpleasant affair. It consists largely of changing nappies, washing dishes, and dealing with temper tantrums, which nobody likes to do. Yet most parents declare that the children are their chief source of happiness. Does it mean that people don't really know what's good for them? That's one option. Another is that the findings demonstrate that happiness is not the surplus of pleasant over unpleasant moments. Rather, happiness consists in seeing one's life in its entirety as meaningful and worthwhile. There is an important cognitive and ethical component to happiness. Our values make all the difference to whether we see ourselves as miserable slaves to a baby dictator or lovingly nurturing a new life. As Nietzsche put it, if you have a why to live, you can bear almost any how. A meaningful life can be satisfying, even in the midst of hardship, whereas a meaningless life is a terrible ordeal, no matter how comfortable it is. Though people in all cultures and eras have felt the same type of pleasures and pains, the meaning that they have ascribed to their experience has probably varied widely. If so, the history of happiness might have been far more turbulent than biologists imagine. It's a conclusion that does not necessarily favor modernity. Assessing life minute by minute, medieval people certainly had it rough. However, if they believed the promise of everlasting bliss in the afterlife, they may well have viewed their lives as far more meaningful and worthwhile than modern secular people, who in the long term can expect nothing but complete and meaningless oblivion. Asked, "Are you satisfied with your life as a whole?" people in the Middle Ages might have scored quite highly in a subjective well-being questionnaire. So our medieval ancestors were happy. Because they found meaning to life in collective delusions about the afterlife. Yes. As long as nobody punctured their fantasies, why shouldn't they? As far as we can tell, from a purely scientific viewpoint, human life has absolutely no meaning. Humans are the outcome of blind evolutionary processes that operate without goal or purpose. Our actions are not a part of some divine cosmic plan, and if planet Earth were to blow up tomorrow morning, the universe would probably keep going about its business as usual. As far as we can tell at this point, human subjectivity would not be missed. Hence, any meaning that people ascribe to their lives is just a delusion. The otherworldly meanings medieval people found in their lives were no more deluded than the modern humanist, nationalist, and capitalist meanings that modern people find. The scientist who says that her life is meaningful because she increases the store of human knowledge, the soldier who declares that his life is meaningful because he fights to defend his homeland, and the entrepreneur who finds meaning in building a new company are no less delusional than their medieval counterparts who found meaning in reading scriptures, going on a crusade, or building a new cathedral. So perhaps happiness is synchronizing one person's delusions of meaning with the prevailing collective delusions. As long as my personal narrative is in line with the narratives of the people around me, I can convince myself that my life is meaningful, and find happiness in that conviction. This is quite a depressing conclusion. Does happiness really depend on self-delusion? Sapiens, know thyself. If happiness is based on feeling pleasant sensations, then in order to be happier, we need to re-engineer our biochemical system. If happiness is based on feeling that life is meaningful, then in order to be happier, we need to delude ourselves more effectively. Is there a third alternative? Both the above views share the assumption that happiness is some sort of subjective feeling of either pleasure or meaning, and that in order to judge people's happiness, all we need to do is ask them how they feel. To many of us, it seems logical because the dominant religion of our age is liberalism. Liberalism sanctifies the subjective feelings of individuals. It views these feelings as the supreme source of authority. What is good and what is bad, what is beautiful and what is ugly, and what ought to be and what ought not to be, are all determined by what each one of us feels. Liberal politics is based on the idea that the voters know best, and that there is no need for Big Brother to tell us what is good for us. Liberal economics is based on the idea that the customer is always right. Liberal art declares that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Students in liberal schools and universities are taught to think for themselves. Commercials urge us to just do it. Action films, stage dramas, soap operas, novels, and catchy pop songs indoctrinate us constantly. Be true to yourself. Listen to yourself. Follow your heart. Jean-Jacques Rousseau stated this view most classically. What I feel to be good is good. What I feel to be bad is bad. People who've been raised from infancy on a diet of such slogans are prone to believe that happiness is a subjective feeling and that each individual best knows whether he or she is happy or miserable. Yet this view is unique to liberalism. Most religions and ideologies throughout history stated that there are objective yardsticks for goodness and beauty and for how things ought to be. They were suspicious of the feelings and the preferences of the ordinary person. At the entrance of the temple of Apollo at Delphi, pilgrims were greeted by the inscription, "Know thyself." The implication was that the average person is ignorant of his true self, and is therefore likely to be ignorant of true happiness. Freud would probably concur. And so would Christian theologians. St. Paul and St. Augustine knew perfectly well that if you asked most people about it, most of them would prefer to have sex than pray to God. Does that prove that having sex is the key to happiness? Not according to Paul and Augustine. It proves only that humankind is sinful by nature, and that people are easily seduced by Satan. From a Christian viewpoint, the vast majority of people are in more or less the same situation as heroin addicts. Imagine that a psychologist embarks on a study of happiness among drug users. He polls them and finds that they declare, every single one of them, that they are only happy when they shoot up. Would the psychologist publish a paper declaring that heroin is the key to happiness? The idea that feelings are not to be trusted is not restricted to Christianity. At least when it comes to the value of feelings, even Darwin and Dawkins might find common ground with St. Paul and St. Augustine. According to the selfish gene theory, natural selection makes people, like other organisms, choose what is good for the reproduction of their genes, even if it is bad for them as individuals. Most males spend their lives toiling, worrying, competing and fighting, instead of enjoying peaceful bliss, because their DNA manipulates them for its own selfish aims. Like Satan, DNA uses fleeting pleasures to tempt people, to place them in its power. Most religions and philosophies have consequently taken a very different approach to happiness than liberalism does. The Buddhist position is particularly interesting. Buddhism has assigned the question of happiness more importance than perhaps any other human creed. For 2,500 years, Buddhists have systematically studied the essence and the causes of happiness, which is why there is a growing interest among the scientific community, both in their philosophy and their meditation practices. Buddhism shares the basic insight of the biological approach to happiness, namely that happiness results from the processes occurring within one's body, not from the events in the outside world. However, starting from the same insight, Buddhism reaches very different conclusions. According to Buddhism, most people identify happiness with pleasant feelings, while identifying suffering with unpleasant feelings. People consequently ascribe immense importance to what they feel, craving to experience more and more pleasures while avoiding pain. Whatever we do throughout our lives, whether scratching our leg, fidgeting slightly in a chair, or fighting world wars, we are just trying to get pleasant feelings. The problem, according to Buddhism, is that our feelings are no more than fleeting vibrations, changing every moment, like the ocean waves. If 5 minutes ago I felt joyful and purposeful, now these feelings are gone, and I might well feel sad and dejected. So if I want to experience the pleasant feelings, I have to constantly chase them while driving away the unpleasant feelings. Even if I succeed, I immediately have to start all over again, without ever getting any lasting reward for my troubles. What is so important about attaining such ephemeral prizes? Why struggle so hard to achieve something that disappears almost as soon as it arises? According to Buddhism, the root of suffering is neither the root feeling nor According to Buddhism, the root of suffering is neither the feeling of pain, nor of sadness, nor even of meaninglessness. Rather, the real root of suffering is this never-ending and pointless pursuit of ephemeral feelings, which causes us to be in a constant state of tension, restlessness, and dissatisfaction. Due to this pursuit, the mind is never satisfied. Even when experiencing pleasure, it is not content, because it fears that this feeling might soon disappear, and craves that this feeling should stay and intensify. People are liberated from suffering not when they experience this or that fleeting pleasure, but rather when they understand that the impermanent nature of all their feelings and stop craving them. This is the aim of Buddhist meditation practices. In meditation, you are supposed to closely observe your mind and body, witness the ceaselessness arising and passing of all your feelings, and realize how pointless it is to pursue them. When the pursuit stops, the mind becomes very relaxed, clear, and satisfied. All kinds of feelings go on arising and passing: joy, anger, boredom, lust. But once you stop craving particular feelings, you can just accept them for what they are. You live in the present moment instead of fantasizing about what might have been. The resulting serenity is so profound that those who spend their lives in frenzied pursuit of pleasant feeling can hardly imagine it. It is like a man standing for decades on the seashore, embracing certain good waves and trying to prevent them from disintegrating, while simultaneously pushing back bad waves to prevent them from getting near him. Day in, day out, the man stands on the beach, driving himself crazy with this fruitless exercise. Eventually, he sits down on the sand and just allows the waves to come and go as they please. How peaceful. This idea is so alien to modern liberal culture that when Western New Age movements encountered Buddhist insights, they translated them into liberal terms, thereby turning them on their head. New Age cults frequently argue happiness does not depend on external conditions. It depends only on what we feel inside. People should stop pursuing external achievements such as wealth and status and connect instead with their inner feelings. Or, more succinctly, happiness begins within. This is exactly what biologists argue, but more or less the opposite of what Buddha said. Buddha agreed with modern biology and New Age movements that happiness is independent of external conditions. Yet his more important and far more profound insight was that the true happiness is also independent of our inner feelings. Indeed, the more significance we give our feelings, the more we crave them, the more we suffer. Buddha's recommendation was to stop not only the pursuit of external achievements, but also the pursuit of inner feelings. To sum up, Subjective well-being questionnaires identify our well-being with our subjective feelings, and identify the pursuit of happiness with the pursuit of particular emotional states. In contrast, for many traditional philosophies and religions, such as Buddhism, the key to happiness is to know the truth about yourself, to understand who or what you really are. Most people wrongly identify themselves with their feelings, thoughts, likes, and desires. When they feel anger, they think, "I am angry, this is my anger." They consequently spend their life avoiding some kinds of feelings and pursuing others. They never realize that they are not their feelings, and that the relentless pursuit of particular feelings just traps them in their misery. If this is so, then our entire understanding of the history of happiness might be misguided. Maybe it isn't so important whether people's expectations are fulfilled, and whether they enjoy the pleasant feelings. The main question is whether people know the truth about themselves. What evidence do we have that people today understand this truth any better than ancient foragers or medieval peasants? Scholars began to study the history of happiness only a few years ago, and we are still formulating initial hypotheses and searching for appropriate research methods. It's much too early to adopt rigid conclusions and end a debate that's hardly yet begun. What is important is to get to know as many different approaches as possible and to ask the right questions. Most history books focus on the ideas of great thinkers, the bravery of warriors, the charity of saints, and the creativity of artists. They have much to tell about the weaving and unraveling of social structures, about the rise and fall of empires, about the discovery and spread of technologies, yet they say nothing about how all this influenced the happiness and suffering of individuals. This is the biggest lacuna of understanding of history. We had better start filling it.